It's time now for Focus. The bitter civil war in South Sudan is now well into its third year and shows no sign of ending after violent clashes between the government and opposition forces in the capital last July. The unrest has now spread to the normally peaceful Equatoria region close to Uganda. A peace deal signed between President Salva Kiir and the rebels now hangs in the balance, with the opposition leader forced into exile. The humanitarian cost of the fighting has been huge. While famine no longer exists, the UN says that 2 million people still remain on the brink of malnutrition.
These soldiers are at the helm of the government's efforts to keep a growing insurgency at bay. Colonel Dominic Ajak prepares his men for their deployment around Yei town.
Like every day, we have difficult tasks to accomplish. Those who usually man the checkpoints take up your positions. The others stay here. This is very important. Do you understand me?
The colonel makes a tour of the checkpoints set up along the main roads leaving town. After fresh fighting broke out in July 2016, rebel leader and then First Vice President Machar fled the country, passing through the southern region of Equatoria. Since then, fighting has consumed this part of South Sudan. Yei is practically under siege, accessible only by air. Armed groups lay ambushes along the roads, making any movement difficult.
People is in the bush. When somebody is coming, is a sheikh. And when he's going to town, they can march in town, is a security. Yes, it's make a security first.
But even though the government vows to protect civilians, none remain in the areas surrounding the checkpoints. Like most of the town's population, they fled to Uganda. In a recent report, the UN accused the government army and its militia, consisting of ethnic Dinka, of targeting not just rebels, but also civilians. The government denies this. To prove that civilians feel safe in their presence, the soldiers encourage us to interview this tea lady.
We aren't afraid of attacks. I can do my business here. That way I can make a living.
Any other response would be difficult in the soldiers' presence. In 2014, Yei had a population of 260,000 inhabitants. Only a few thousand remain. For the army, that's proof enough that life is normal. But away from the town center, we meet someone who tells a different story. This man says he was arrested and beaten by government soldiers. They accused him of being a rebel, simply because he belonged to a different ethnic group than the soldiers, most of whom are ethnic Dinka.
They really beat people anyhow, using these rubber bands from the vehicle tires. When you are beaten, you cry, they laugh at you.
Threatening to kill him, the soldiers warned him not to skip town. Many men who do manage to leave end up joining the rebellion. But the government claims it's fighting criminals, or so-called unknown gunmen. It denies the existence of any armed opposition group other than a faction led by current First Vice President Taban Dengai, who split from Machar last year.
IO has first-class people. IO has ministries, and they are part of the government of South Sudan. There is no IO in the bush. Those in the bush, they are criminals.
We decided to see for ourselves what has become of Riek Machar's opposition movement. We crossed over to rebel-held parts of Equatoria to find more than just a few bandits in the bush. Full of zeal, these rebel soldiers head to the front lines near the town of Kajukeji. Rebel leader Riek Machar may be in exile, but these men remain loyal to him. They also claim to be gaining ground here. General Moses Lokujo, an Equatorian who defected from the government, takes us to a village his men recently recaptured.
From this mountain to where the enemies are is now 2 kilometers. Now they cannot move anymore because Juba Road, we have put more forces also there to protect our civilians.
The rebels' guerrilla tactics give them an edge in the vast rural areas, but they're unable to take towns or repel government offensives, like the attack from 2 weeks earlier. When the rebels retreated, government forces reportedly destroyed the village.
Our enemies come and they start fighting, so it's not getting our soldiers around. Then it's broken the houses and it's burned the books and it's taking the many things here in this school.
Such targeting of civilian infrastructure is central to the government's counterinsurgency strategy, aimed at eliminating grassroots support for the opposition. Equatoria was once South Sudan's most developed region, but now schools are destroyed and villages have turned into ghost towns. Everywhere we find evidence of shattered lives. The majority of the population has fled to Uganda, but around 30,000 people have sought shelter behind rebel lines. Agnes Kiden came to this camp for internally displaced persons after the killing of her husband, 3-year-old daughter, and several neighbors.
My daughter ran to her dad after he was arrested, and he carried her. But then the same bullet that killed my husband also went through my daughter, and they both fell. After the soldiers had left, that's when I came out and found them dead on the ground.
Agnes blames the atrocities on government soldiers, specifically from the Dinka tribe.
They are Dinka, but one of them spoke in Arabic, saying if they find the rebels and they start fighting, only the trees will be spared. Anything else living, even chickens and goats, will be killed.
Many people here see the opposition as their protectors, their boys, as they often call them. But the rebels, too, seem to bear some responsibility for civilian deaths. Their presence exposes the population to collective punishment by the government.
The rebels know if they fight the government and the government has a lot of casualties, they transfer that anger to civilians. They start shooting at civilians and killing them.
While civilians bear the brunt of the conflict, it's clear that neither side can secure a decisive military victory. Until a new peace process brings all the parties to the negotiating table, violence is likely to rage on.
Well, for more, we can speak now to Jonathan Pedno, a researcher from the African Division of Human Rights Watch, who joins us now live from the Norwegian capital. Thank you very much for being with us here on France 24. Now, as I understand it, just last month, your team and yourself were working near the town of Kajo-Keji that was featured in that focus report. Talk us through some of your findings there.
Indeed, we did go to northern Uganda for a couple of weeks where we met with more than 100 refugees from Kajo-Keji, who all thoroughly described to us how they were either witnesses or themselves victims of horrible abuses on the part of government forces. That ranges from troops basically coming into marketplaces, starting to shoot, killing civilians, to them seeing all of their possessions being looted, or their cousins or brothers or themselves being arrested and taken into military barracks where some of them have been horribly tortured. So obviously horrible tales of abuses that we have gathered, more than 46 allegations of killings between June 2016 and May 2017, the latest of which shortly before we left was this case of 8 men who were gathered into a house that was then set on fire. 2 of them escaped. The other ones, unfortunately, died. Those were all civilians, and they were caught in this horrible conflict that's been lasting for way too long now.
Is it possible in any way to say whether it's been the government troops or the rebels that are responsible for the most violations? Is it possible to try and separate them?
Certainly, since the signing of the peace agreement, one could easily say that the government has been responsible for the bulk of the abuses that have been committed in South Sudan. That does not in any way lessen the serious nature of abuses that have been committed by the opposition. But the opposition, by virtue of not having claimed much ground over the past year and a half, has not really been able to reach areas where there are civilians that are, that they would consider as supportive of the government. Whereas the government, on the other hand, has managed to gain much more ground in areas that are deemed as supportive of the opposition and have actively been targeting civilians as part of their counterinsurgency tactics. And those counterinsurgencies have been, responsible for driving hundreds of thousands of civilians now into DRC, into the Democratic Republic of Congo, but also Uganda and the Sudan, creating what is right now the largest refugee crisis on the African continent.
And just on that point, what's the situation like for those that have managed to escape this fighting in those refugee camps in northern Uganda?
Well, certainly the situation is extremely difficult. I mean, one can imagine when you have to leave your hometown, and for most of the people that we spoke to, it was the second or the third time that they had to leave or flee South Sudan for their lives because of the war, whether it was the war in the 1980s or 1990s against the government of Sudan or this current one. A lot of people have had to abandon everything, abandon their lives, abandon their hopes behind them in order to escape this atrocious violence. So the situation obviously is quite difficult for those people. They have to start anew. There is very little money and resources made available at the moment by the international community to help and face this refugee crisis. The Ugandan government is obviously doing as much as it can. On the other hand, Uganda sadly enough, continues in many ways to support the Kiir government, which is responsible in the first place for driving all of those hundreds of thousands of civilians into Uganda. And so we think that it's essential that as much as money goes into responding to this crisis in northern Uganda, this refugee crisis into northern Uganda, that the Ugandan government and the donors also call for an end to abuses by government forces.
And very briefly, I also want to talk about famine. The government and the UN have both announced this week that famine has been eradicated across South Sudan, but that 2 million civilians are still at risk.
Well, I mean, famine, when it was declared, was, just a way of describing an atrocious situation. And though the situation in terms of access to food may have gotten better in parts because it's the rainy season now, it by no means that the situation in South Sudan generally has improved. I mean, we still have abuses, we still have displacements, we still have about 3.7 million people out of a population of about 11 million people who have been forced out of their homes because of fighting. And though we may now, for the next few months, have some kind of respite in terms of the intensity of the fighting because of the rainy season, making it difficult for armed parties to move around, we're likely to see a resumption of this fighting and a very violent one in the fall. And so it's essential, really, that the priority be put on ensuring that the parties respect human rights and that the parties eventually agree to some kind of political agreement that will bring this war to an end.
Okay, Jonathan Pedno from the African Division of Human Rights Watch in Norway. Thank you very much for being with us here on France 24.